All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And today, inshallah, we're going to be continuing what we were doing with tafsir. And certainly we were at the ayah وَقَدْ نَزَّلَ عَلَيْكُمْ. So here's the ayah, Surah Nisa. And it is ayah 140. وَقَدْ نَزَّلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الْكِتَابِ أن إِذَا سَمِعْتُمْ آيات الله يكفر بها ويستهزأ بها فلا تقعدوا معهم. And we went in details in that regards, and we said, of course, it's simply because the environment that you're surrounding yourself with is basically going to be the environment that you are part of, that will eventually rub and have its influence on your aqidah, on your behavior. So therefore, choosing the environment that you're surrounding yourself with is basically a very important thing and a very important tool to really changing who you are. This is a key thing. If you want to become a better Muslim, well, choose the environment that contains better Muslims, and you're going to see yourself, even though you might feel that you don't really belong in there, but that's shaitan actually coming to tell you that you're not belonging in there. It's an issue of getting out of your comfort zone and being with what you know is actually right, which is right there, the salihin, surrounding yourself with salihin, and of course not surrounding yourself with those that would yahudu fi ayatillah, or that would speak or make fun of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or make fun of the ayat, or make fun of Islam. Don't join these groups whatsoever, because you would become part of them. And of course, similarly, on the other hand, because you always want to read the ayat in different ways. So the first way is that, yes, if it's telling you not to sit with those that would be basically being in mockery about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words or about Islam, well, the same thing in where you would want to also switch that. So who am I supposed to be sitting with? Well, sitting with the people that are basically believing in the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those that do not make fun of ayat Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those that are learning it. And of course, certainly, if we're talking about those people, فَلَا تَقْعُدُوا مَعَهُمْ, don't sit with them, then that actually means you want to surround yourself with those that are taking the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a place of education, as a place of conviction, as a place of enlightenment, right there. Why? Because just like innakum idan mithluhum, in the case where these people were mocking the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, same thing. You, as Shafi'i used to say, where I'm not from the Salihin, but just by imitating the Salihin, that in itself is a success. It's a road to success, even though I'm not part of the Salihin. And who's saying that? That's a Shafi'i, mind you. All right. So that's a Shafi'i. When did he die? 205-year Hijriya. He said, I'm not from the Salihin, but I would mimic them, I would imitate them, I would basically embrace what they're doing, because that's enough for me to realize that I'm on the pathway to success. And that's the same thing in where, even if you might actually feel that these people are better than me, just be around the good people, and it will rub on you. Be around the people of dhikr, be around the people of talab al-ilm, be around the people that are actually engaging in Islamic activism. You'll be part of that. It will start influencing you. You don't necessarily, and you don't necessarily have to feel that you are as active, as scholarly, no, it's an issue of you deciding that you want to be a part of this. It's you wanting to be around these people, because the Prophet ﷺ actually said, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum." Whoever imitates any group of people, then he's part of them. So what does that mean? من تشبه من تشبه any group of people. التشبيه or التشبه is basically to mimic, to imitate, in the way they talk, in the way they dress, in the way they play their jokes, in any way. All of that would basically rub on you. It becomes who you are. So what do you want to do? Eventually, the group that you're hanging out with, they'll basically have their impact on you. So that's why don't sit with the munafiqeen, don't sit with the kafirin. But the Prophet ﷺ actually said, لا يأكل طعامك إلا مؤمن. Only eat with a mu'min. Only have a mu'min eat with you. Now, this doesn't mean you don't want to share with a disbeliever, but this is actually telling you on a regular basis, who do you want to be friends with? Who are you eating with? Who are you engaging and having fun with and entertaining yourself with? Who are you basically considering as your best friend? Why? Because it is part of our human nature, as part of the animal nature, in where the birds that flock together, they're basically the ones that are alike. And that's the same thing. If you want to decide certain traits of yours, we could see that studies even say that if you hang out with those that are successful, your chances of being and becoming successful actually increase. And if you were to hang out, even if you're a successful person, a smart person, but if you're hanging out around people that are not successful, your chances do actually decrease, your chances of success do actually decrease by 30%, compared to your chances of success by hanging out with the right people, with the successful people, increasing by 15%. So, in other words, even teach your children at school, hang out with the smart boys, hang out with the boys that are trying to be the best kids in class, because that's going to increase your chance of actually being a smart student and increase your chances of you trying to compete with them. When we create this competition, a sense of competition, a sense of also feeling an embracement, feeling surrounded by a certain group of people, it basically starts affecting you without you realizing. And that's one method in where, it's a very important thing. In the Sufi groups, there's the Shaykh. The Shaykh basically teaches the murid. The murid is supposed to be the student. But one thing that is really missing in other groups is the mentorship that the Shaykh actually has in teaching and mentoring the طلاب العلم, or at least those that are murideen, in where the Shaykh would mentor the student, the murid, who not to sit with, who not to engage in the areas, when to change the job, when it's a fitna, how to grow their iman little by little. And this is one of those things that the sheikh might actually mentor the students in, to change the circles that they're engaging in, to change the circles that they're basically surrounding themselves with. By changing these circles, they're actually changing their heart, they're changing their behavior, they're changing themselves. So that's one way. Even if you don't have a sheikh, for example, you yourself learn what tools can help you and which ways can help you create, let's call it the Iman therapy. The Iman therapy, part of it is choosing your circle of friends, choosing your circle of engagement, choosing your circle of dialogue, choosing who are you hanging out with and who you're basically getting that influence without you recognizing from. So that's why, and what is that going to do? Well, basically, that it's not going to just change what kind of topics you're discussing, but it's also going to be changing even your aspirations. And that's why the aspirations for those that were sitting with the munafiqeen, in where they were getting the aspiration to somehow seek what? Defeat for the ummah. So it goes beyond a social circle to actually becoming a political engagement without you realizing. It goes from a individual, let's call it this way, where it's an individual commitment, or it's an individual choice, and then it goes into a social circle, and then from a social circle in where it becomes a political engagement, from a political engagement into without you realizing, then that's going to actually determine whether you are part of the mu'mineen group or whether part of the kafirin group. What did it start with? Well, it started with you making the choice. Which group do you really want to hang out with? What circle is influencing you? And certainly, what political engagement are you going to be a part of? And this is really how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is really taking us in those ayat. الذين يتربصون بكم فإن كان لكم فتح من الله قالوا ألم نكن معكم وإن كان الكافرين نصيب قالوا ألم نستحوذ عليكم ونمنعكم من المؤمنين. Because why? We said, well, weren't we with you? In other words, they were actually engaging with the mu'mineen at times. Were they always there? They were at times with the mu'mineen and at times with the kafirin, and they would change their positions and they would change their faces. They would put on a different mask. When they're with the kafirin, they would actually put a mask if they were the ones that were going to be getting some form of success. They would put on a mask that they're actually a part of them. And of course, certainly, if the mu'mineen were victorious, then they would basically tell them, weren't we with you? We need the outcomes and, of course, the successes of whatever they would get. So what they were really seeking is not necessarily letting the principle drive them, but they were actually letting their own interests drive them. And those that were the munafiqeen. When the interest becomes the drive, that's when you will basically see a lack of consistency in their behavior, a lack of consistency in their commitment, a lack of consistency even in their iman. So when we're looking at this one, قالوا ألم نستحوذ عليكم ونمنعكم من المؤمنين. What action did they take in order to show whenever they were with the kafirin that they were a part of them? They were basically trying to show that, hey, when we were amongst the mu'mineen, we would do whatever it takes. We were engaging in some form of political, social activism in trying to create within their hearts a sense of defeat, a sense in order to make them get a psychological defeat. And that was our way. That was their way in creating such groups and creating, of course, such relationships with them. So the sister said, what if you can find such people? Once you said, become what you want to be like. What if you can't find such people? If you can't find such people, you create a circle. If you cannot create the circle, if you don't have the means to create the circle, you be the leader and don't necessarily find yourself or put yourself in such wrong circles. So
I have a
it's
question.
never justified. Go ahead, Nora.
Yeah, can you explain inconsistency?
Fair enough. When we're speaking about inconsistency, of course, in order to be consistent with your iman, with your deen, to create such consistency, you actually have to build a vision first. There's no way that you can be consistent on something unless you actually have a vision of what you want to be. But of course, it's not enough to just have an idea unless you actually had the steps for it. It's exactly like when you would create any management. You have to have an idea, the final goal, what you want to get to, and then to create and to go to that final goal, you're basically creating a plan. The plan starts out with being a visual plan, and then there's that consistency. In order to put such a visual plan in action, you're being consistent in putting the visual plan to get to the actual implementation where you're consistent every single day. You're focused on the final goal. What is the final goal? The final goal is Jannah. The final goal is akhirah. That's what consistency means. Consistency in where you're laying out your vision, you're putting in the implementation, you're laying out your action, you're staying consistent in where you're staying committed to what you had actually yourself had wanted to be within your vision as a mu'mina, in where you wanted to get to Jannah. So what do? You have a certain plan for Fajr. You have a certain plan for your talab al-ilm. You have a certain plan for raising your children. You have a certain plan for how you are engaged with your husband. You have a certain plan of who is within your circle, your social circle, and who's out of your social circle. You have got a certain plan on how you spend your money. This is consistency in where your deen, your nafs, your mental health, your ird, your life, and of course, certainly even the way you spend your money, your income, the way you spend the money management, all of that is basically consistent with one idea, which is the purpose that preceded your existence. It's to get to Jannah. That's the consistency in where you're taking it not only in vision, but you're putting it in as an implementation and a plan for your akhirah to get all the way there. Well, that's what we mean by consistency. Good question, Noura. So right there, in where they basically فالله Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says يحكم بينكم يوم القيامة. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will judge these people. Why? Because their goal, of course, as believers is not this life, but their goal is in the akhirah right there. فالله يحكم بينكم, in where you would know that don't put yourself in where you're trying to, okay, this person is a munafiq, this person is a mu'min, this person is this, because that's not what you actually want to get yourself busy with. Because you want to keep in mind that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to judge. Don't get yourself busy in the corner of trying to sift the people and classify the people. Is this person a mu'min? Is this person not a mu'min? Who, where, and where they belong? That's not what you want to get yourself busy with, because that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there telling you, well, leave that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But you do have to know those corners in where recognize وَلَن يَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ سَبِيلًا. Now here's a couple questions here. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not give the kafirin over the mu'mineen, over the believers, the word is sabila. What is sabila? Well, sabil can actually mean path. Sabil can mean power, and at least in the literally the word just means path, but in this context it can mean power. It can mean authority. It can mean some kind of a victory. All these different things, and where. So, what does it really mean? And that's why when you look at Al-Qurtubi went in details of what that actually means in terms of وَلَا يَجْعَلُهُ الْكَافِرِينَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ سَبِيلًا. And he said that scholars actually had 5 different interpretations. The first interpretation in where this is actually in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not have the kafirin have any power or any victory on the mu'mineen, in where he said, well, that's on Judgment Day. Well, if we are to actually say that's on Judgment Day, that would actually mean that there's going to come a time where the Muslims are actually going to be defeated in where, to the point when we're speaking about the Muslims being defeated, we're actually talking about that the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually becoming silent, mute, from having its power to influence people. Now, let me just say one thing here. When we look at political situations, and when we see a certain political group, a Muslim group, going strong or going defeated, or the Muslim Ummah is basically defeated militarily, defeated politically, defeated economically. What does that actually mean? Well, that would really, in the sense that the way it plays on ground, is that how far is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right now reaching? What is the momentum that it is actually carrying out? So when we measure that, we don't measure that by just looking at numbers of population. But that's one way, but that's not enough. So whenever we would measure an idea, we would look at the idea and the political power, or even, the political power, or even the military power that it actually has on ground. Why? Because the political power and the military power, and certainly such power will later on become in where that idea would become imposed on the people without them realizing. Imposed, but there's no compulsion in religion. Well, here's the thing. Yes, indeed, there's no compulsion in religion. But you want to keep in mind that when we're speaking about political power, the political power has the force to set a certain type of an educational system. It has a certain type of giving even certain freedoms in where setting certain ideas, setting certain cultures. It basically builds a certain system without you realizing. And that's the same thing in where even political power at one point, even in history, when Muslims were actually focusing as well on political power, but then, yes, the ayah says there's no compulsion. It actually gave them those that wanted to practice Islam, one, the freedom, the space to practice Islam, to find Islam. And number two, the political power was also putting in a system to let people know about the religion, to let people have the space to engage and interact and certainly understand the details of the deen. And without us realizing, this political power not only in Islam, but that's the same thing with each and every single system. If you're looking at the communist system, that's the same way it worked. The communist system was growing with the USSR, and of course, the bigger that geographical area it was controlling, and certainly taking in more and more allies, was actually becoming this the ideological power that was also influencing many people around the world in adopting communism. Same thing when you're talking about liberalism. This is the reality of every single political group, by the way. And same thing when you're talking about right now, even America. You're seeing, of course, the LGBT right now. It's a political power. You're speaking about the Western liberalism. It's a political power. Secularism. It's a political power, and enforcing it upon others. If you don't adopt such ideologies, we will basically cut you off economically. We will basically consider you going against human rights, and the list goes on and on. It basically becomes an ideology in where it is going beyond a political power to actually having a social influence, an ideological influence, and certainly going at the end targeting the individual. And that's the same thing everywhere. And when we're looking at this one, if we're actually explaining that as just Yawm al-Qiyamah, that would actually mean that the idea, here's the core that we wanted to get to, that the idea of Islam at one point might actually be defeated. And that's why Ibn al-Arabi said, well, this is actually a very weak interpretation, because to say that this is Yawm al-Qiyamah is to actually say that the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will one day be eliminated. even though we do know at the end of times to mean at the end of times in life, that certainly there's not going to be anyone recognizing the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, recognizing anything that's in the Quran, where there's going to be a time where people will just remember once upon a time we heard people say that there was such a thing as God. In other words, the idea will be completely eliminated from the people and then even all of humanity. So right there, Ibn al-Arabi, this is different than the Sufi, let's say the Sufi figure, the Ibn Arabi. That's a different guy. Ibn al-Arabi is a Maliki scholar. We actually talked about him before in his book, Ahkam al-Quran. So he said, وَهَذَا ضَعِيف. This is extremely weak, a very weak interpretation. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically in the beginning of the ayat where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically telling us that no, there's a certain political arena, there's a certain social spectrum, there are all these different areas in where when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاللَّهُ يَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ, or فَاللَّهُ يَحْكُمُ, was it بَيْنَهُم or بَيْنَكُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ? And where, what was the ayah saying? Okay, now you guys got to help me. Forgot what the ayah was actually saying. Was it بَيْنَكُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ فَاللَّهُ يَحْكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ, in where Allah, oh, it's right there in front of me. All right, anywhere Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was right there telling us there, Yawm al-Qiyamah, yes, this is right there at eventually, but there's nothing new to this. We already know all of this. So that's why he basically said, no, what this actually means is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really giving us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will actually judge them in where it's a form that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold them accountable. In other words, whatever action they're engaging in, it's basically going to affect and influence their deen, their heart, their behavior, and on Judgment Day, they're going to be held accountable. Let's say the other interpretation, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, according to the second interpretation, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not give those people, whether the people that are munafiqeen or whether the kafirin, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not give them the power to eliminate dawlat al-mu'minin, the power, or at least the governance of the mu'mineen, and that they would not get the power to completely eliminate even their influence, or even, of course, somehow have the power within the community. But we know that already happened. We know that already. This historically, we know that, hey, we had the Mongols in 656 Hijriya. They basically came in and completely, of course, committed huge massacres in Baghdad. And then later on, we know that the Crusades had actually come in a couple times, not once or twice, but a couple times, and actually committed major massacres in Al-Quds and major massacres in Damascus and different parts of the Muslim countries. And then we know that we had not only the Crusades, but later on the Western countries. They basically came in, whether it's in, of course, in colonizing the Muslim world in Sykes-Picot in 1917, and later on, of course, the Muslim Khilafah ended in 1924. Whatever happened to that? How do we understand and put it within this context? Let's understand it. Let's look at this hadith. This hadith, Thawban, just an idea about Thawban. Thawban was actually a slave, but the Prophet ﷺ had actually freed him. So the Prophet ﷺ, Thawban hears that the Prophet ﷺ had said, and I had asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not to defeat or eliminate the ummah in a massive, what is the word, famine. In other words, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would protect the ummah from getting eliminated with probably a plague happening, or probably some famine happening in where? وَأَلَّا, look at the word, يُسَلِّطَ عَلَيْهِمْ عَدُوًّا مِنْ سِوَى أَنفُسِهِمْ فَيَسْتَبِيحَ بَيْضَتَهُمْ وَإِنَّ رَبِّي قال يا محمد إني إذا قضيت قضاء فإنه لا يرد وإني قد أعطيت لأمتك ألا أهلكهم بسنة أو بسنة عامة وألا أسلط عليهم عدوا من سوى أنفسهم فيستبيح بيضتهم ولو اجتمع عليهم من بأقطارها حتى يكون بعضهم يهلك بعضا. This is stop right there. Now look at this. In where the Prophet ﷺ made the dua. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically says, the Prophet ﷺ, sorry, that he had asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, made the dua, that there would not be an enemy except from within the Muslim community. In other words, the worst enemy that we have is not the outside enemy. It is actually within. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O Muhammad, if I decree a matter, then it cannot be changed. And I had given your ummah that I would not whatsoever eliminate them with a complete famine in where it wipes them totally, and that I would not have any power and from outside of themselves. In other words, the enemy is not going to be from the outside, but is actually going to be from within. Our enemy is from within. And that enemy, why? Because the Prophet ﷺ did not want an enemy coming from outside and then eliminating the ummah. So, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, the enemy is going to be within. And that way, even if all the people from all the countries would unite to eliminate the ummah, they would not be capable of doing that. It is only unless the ummah itself basically shreds and eliminates one another. And they would be the ones to enslave one another. Now, this is really scary because what we're seeing, we're oftentimes focused on speaking about colonization and the impact of colonization and the Western world and how, they're right now defeating us. And we're actually looking at the wrong corner. The real place of the real problem, the real place of the problem, you pointed, it's really within ourselves. It is really within ourselves. And that's why even when we're speaking about colonization, the colonization actually put, let's say, if we're going to Jordan, let's say put Sharif Hussein there. And if we're going to, of course, Iraq right there, put all these people. And we're talking about, of course, North Africa. We're talking about Bourguiba. We're talking about the so-called Amir al-Mu'mineen. And we're talking about Algeria, same thing. And that we're talking about all these different countries that, and of course, the same thing when we're speaking about even the sub-Indian continent. We're speaking about even the other Muslim countries. Even the other Muslim countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, same thing. Even when we're speaking about Malaysia, etc., we're actually talking about that our enemy is within ourselves. Our enemy is going to be named Muhammad. He's going to be named Ali. He's going to be named Mustafa. They're going to be named Muslim names, but they're actually the ones that are working in favor and in the interest of our enemy. And this is extremely dangerous, in where, without us realizing, a lot of our political engagement, a lot of our powers is really disseminated, is really divided, is really broken up by who? By our own people, by our own Muslim named people. They're actually the ones to really divide us. All right, let's see. The third interpretation in where, number one, in where they're basically إلا أن يتواصوا بالباطل ولا يتناهوا عن المنكر. In other words, ويتقاعدوا عن التوبة فيكون تسليط العدو من قبلهم. In where he said, well, the third interpretation is that no, when we're looking at that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not have the kafirin have sabil or power over the mu'mineen, and what that is going to mean, except in situations when the mu'mineen all of the sudden are actually engaging. In other words, they had adopted al-batil, they had adopted, let's say, the non-Muslim practice, the non-Muslim vision, the non-Muslim culture, the non-Muslim behavior, and they would not forbid and they would not stop, and certainly they would not change such behavior. Then what happens? The Muslims are right now really adopting the non-Muslim behavior, the non-Muslim vision. In other words, they had actually become their let's call them part of their group, and therefore يتقاعدوا عن التوبة, then they won't be capable of actually making tawbah or even recognizing what needs to be changed. So what happens? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have the enemy really be within themselves. Who are these? They're the people that had actually adopted the vision, the practice, and certainly the commitment of those that are kuffar. They're named Muhammad, they're named Ali, they're named Uthman, they're named all these names. But the truth of the matter is that they're actually adopting the mission, the vision, and certainly the implementation of those that are basically kafirin. Why? This interpretation said, well, what we're saying is that there's another ayah that supports all of this, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا أَصَابَكُم مِّن مُّصِيبَةٍ فَبِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِيكُم. Whatever calamity that you would go through, it is really as a result of what you had been practicing, what you had planted. In other words, what you harvest is really what you plant, and that's right there. So Ibn al-Arabi responded and commented on this, and he said, وَهَذَا نَفِيسٌ جِدًّا. And he said, and this is a very valuable interpretation. وَهَذَا نَفِيسٌ جِدًّا, very valuable interpretation, in where we recognize that when we adopt the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we implement it, when we make it as who we really are as mu'mineen, then this is basically the interpretation for the ayah, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, وَلَا يَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. In other words, be the mu'mineen, and you will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not make the kafirin have power over you. Just be true mu'mineen. It's basically recommending and telling you, well, that actually fits with another ayah, even though it's not mentioned here, in where the other ayah, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُدَافِعُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to actually defend al-mu'mineen. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, you don't have to worry about defending yourself, because if you're part of the mu'mineen, you're going to find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's the one that's going to basically defend you right there. And that's the same thing in where وَلَا يَجْعَلُ اللَّهُ لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ سَبِيلًا. He's telling you, be the mu'mineen, and you will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not, there's no way that the kafirin are going to be capable of defeating you if you're really adopting the path of the mu'mineen. And this, هذا نفيس جدا. Nafis, very valuable interpretation. And when we're looking at that, Al-Qurtubi says, and this is actually evident in the hadith that we had just mentioned, Hadith Thawban, right there. He said this is actually evident in that, in where what this would actually mean, in where if these people, based on the hadith that we said earlier about Thawban, well, that would actually mean, since if these people would basically be named Muslim names but act upon other than the interest of Islam, that would basically be fitting with that hadith, because what we're seeing, of course, even in practice, historically speaking, the ones to have actually defeated us are really not our enemy, but our enemy within, whether that was called, of course, Sharif, or whether that was called Hussein, or whether that was called Muhammad, or that was called Zayn al-Abidin. What a beautiful name, huh? Zayn al-Abidin. Of course, they were the ones, or whether it was called Husni Mubarak, or whether it was called right now Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Look at the name, Abdel Fattah. Wow, what a beautiful name. But then they're the ones that are actually defeating the Ummah. And of course, you've got other names, Mahmoud Abbas. Look at the beautiful Mahmoud Abbas right there. You've got these names, and who are they? They're the ones that are actually working against the Ummah. Let's see the fourth interpretation. إن الله سبحانه لا يجعل الكافرين على المؤمنين سبيلا شرعا. In other words, in where the kafirin, there's no way that you cannot have the kafirin be the ones to be in power, in where the ones to dictate how we practice our legislature and what we actually engage in where, of course, what we're talking about, not only in practice, but we're also talking about having the argument to defeat the Muslims in argument. In other words, the Muslims actually have the argument. It's about them realizing it, learning it, and them standing up to really explain, to be confident in actually expressing the argument. In other words, when you're looking at that ayah, basically right there, in where it's basically telling the mu'mineen, listen, you've got a strong argument. You've got a strong, right there, backup, evidence to support your claim. So therefore, stand strong and confident in the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sister Khadija, you're saying, I'm currently on a journey. If I pray my salah in the airplane while sitting, am I going to make it up after reaching my destination or not? So if you're on the airplane, it depends on the kind of plane that you have, you're in. Well, it's not that you have. Maybe one day you'll have a plane, but if it's a jet plane, you're not going to be capable of at least finding a corner. But if it's those big planes, okay, you can actually pray in, close to where the kitchen is. You can actually get yourself like a little corner and actually pray there. You can ask them where you can find a space to pray, and you can, find a little space right there. But if you do pray, let's say if you're capable of standing on that plane, which normally you can, unless you're really, really 6'6" tall, then you won't be able and capable of standing. But if you are capable of standing, then you have to stand. And if of course, let's say they tell you that you're on a jet plane, there's no space for you to pray in because of the traffic there, fair enough, then you would have to stand in your seat and then do the ruku as much as you can, and certainly the sujood, make it into the body gesture, then in that situation, but don't entirely stay sitting down, because for the parts that you're capable of standing, stand. For the parts that you're not capable of making a sujood or whatever movement, then you're going to be making it into a body gesture. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala get you a safety or arrival. Allahumma ameen. All right, so let's see right there. وَلَا يَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ الْكَافِرِينَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ سَبِيلًا. Of course, when we're speaking about in where eventually, this is the other interpretation, in where eventually eventually, of course, the Muslims will basically have the complete victory. But of course, we're right there in where just learning certain areas, whether it's an argument or whether it's political power or whether it's basically the support, just recognize that as a Muslim, you would basically be getting the backup from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you are part of the mu'mineen. So be part of the mu'mineen and don't worry about getting yourself all that type of protection. You're actually protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إن المنافقين يخادعون الله وهو خادعهم. For the munafiqeen, they would think that they had betrayed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the truth of the matter is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is it here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is khadi'uhum? Does that mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to actually right there commit an evil thing? No, subhanallah, no, this is not what it means. وَهُوَ خَادِعُهُم actually means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created within the system. I want you to focus on this one. Within the system, there's a system in everything. There's a system in physics, a system in chemistry, in biology, all these different things that you cannot really change. In fact, you can't change. You can adapt to it. You can understand it. You can learn it. And there is a system in where if you practice betrayal, you manipulate yourself, you're going to find yourself getting manipulated. In other words, it's not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is manipulating you. It's that there is a reality on ground that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created. Is that, for example, you defeat others, you try to bully others, someone will one day bully you. It's basically going to come back at you in the same direction. Remember, al-jazā'u min jinsil amal. Every single punishment is going to be from the same nature of whatever action that you had committed. And that's the same thing. If the person is committing manipulation, then they're actually manipulating themselves. And same thing, if they're basically harming others, well, they're going to be harming themselves without them realizing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us right there, it's not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically somehow going to be manipulating them, because the word manipulate is to really give the connotation to somehow deceive with an evil intention. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have an evil intention. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all good. But here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling them that there is a system that you cannot get away from. The second you manipulate, it will basically come back to you and you're actually manipulating yourselves. Either what happened, how did they get that far in where they would manipulate and they end up manipulating themselves? It actually started. إِذَا قَامُوا إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ قَامُوا كُسَالَى. When did it start? Look at this. I want you to look at these sentences in where إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ يَخَادِعُونَ اللَّهَ وَهُوَ خَادِعُهُم. So this is more of an informative clause. And then it goes, وَإِذَا قَامُوا إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ. Then it's putting in a different sentence in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is common in the Quran, in where you've got a clause and another clause would, how do these words actually come in such coherence? And where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right there, yes, of course, we don't have any punctuation marks, but in the Quran, it would basically tell you in where these sentences are connected in where, well, now that you recognize that this is right there, a factual thing, that they're manipulating themselves, and eventually, well, they're going to find themselves actually getting into the corner and certainly the consequence of what they dragged themselves into. So, where did it start? إِذَا قَامُوا إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ. Whenever they would get up for prayer, قَامُوا كُسَالَى. They would be getting up lazy. How is that relevant to anything of khadi'a, anything to manipulation? Fair enough. So that's relevant because when the person is not consistent, here we are again. How are we supposed to be consistent? Consistency starts with consistency in prayer. Because the second you're consistent in prayer, you're going to find yourself consistent in action, in behavior. Once you're fixing your salah, you're going to find yourself capable of overcoming the many challenges that require consistency in life. Let's see. For the munafiqeen, when they were not consistent in their salah, they couldn't stand up for their salah. Even for the salah, they would get up lazy. Why are they lazy? Because they didn't have the inner commitment to put it as an action. So what happened? Well, يُرَاءُونَ النَّاسِ. They were really seeking just people's attention, people's basically their acceptance. And what happened? وَلَا يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They would only mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala very few times, or at least barely mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what does that actually mean? Al-Hasan says every single person, whether believer or a munafiq, would actually be given some kind of light on Judgment Day. Why light? What is light supposed to be even helpful in? I thought it was going to be all white and all bright anyways, because the sun is going to be there. Wrong. There are different stations on Judgment Day. Certain stations are going to be pitch black, where the only light that you would have would be the reflection of whether salah, whether dhikr, whether piety you had actually been consistent with. That actually becomes the torch that will pave the way to help you find your path to Jannah, find your path on a sirat all the way to Jannah. So on Judgment Day, remember Surah Al-Hadid. In Surah Al-Hadid, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about al-munafiqeen, they will say, what happens? They will say, انظرونا نقتبس من نوركم. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, well, what they were saying, the munafiqeen, they were like, look, your light is right now reflecting on us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قِيلَ ارْجِعُوا وَرَاءَكُمْ. Just go back. You can't actually be part of them, because
I have
they
a
were
question. Sorry.
let me finish this ayah, Noor.
Okay,
And then they would
okay.
say, أَلَمْ نَكُنْ مَعَكُمْ. Weren't we with you? He said, yes, but you فَتَنْتُمْ أَنفُسَكُمْ. You were with us. You sometimes attended our halaqas. You sometimes attended our activities when we were making a booth. You were there at times, but what you basically fatantum anfusakum. And what happened? You went into al-ghurur. You went into some kind of a self-manipulation where you just wanted the dunya, and that actually led to you losing the light, and then finally finding yourself actually defeated with your own actions and what you had actually committed. And then therefore on Sirat, they'll basically have the light turned off the munafiqeen. Nas'allah al-afwa al-afiyah. So here we go with Surah Al-Hadid right there. And of course, go ahead, Noura, with the question.
Okay, so where did this come from that a lot of Muslims are like, oh yeah, we're Muslim, we're automatically gonna go to Jannah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is gonna intercede for us and all. I mean, where did this come from that someone just assumes that just because they're Muslim, they're automatically gonna go to Jannah?
I think it's there is a hadith, whoever says La ilaha illallah, that they will eventually enter Jannah. And I think it comes from the wrong interpretation for this hadith. They would think, well, all right, I'll eventually enter Jannah, I'll say La ilaha illallah and I'm done. Not recognizing that this is a very simplistic interpretation, because just to say La ilaha illallah, and the word La ilaha illallah is farther than just a word of mouth. It's actually an action, a worship. It's actually a word that you recognize, where you adopt and you embrace in action, in certainly in political action, even in your life, in your social behavior, in your individual moment, in your private moment. So I think it actually comes from a very simplistic interpretation for that hadith. I think this is where that misunderstanding comes from. But that's where it's really important
Okay,
to get
Jazakallah khair.
it's really important to get the ilm, because with ilm, you're actually getting the right interpretation, you're getting the right vision, and you're not putting yourself in a self-delusion. And of course, with self-delusion, you're basically going to be putting in yourself with إن المنافقين يخادعون الله وهو خادعهم, in where they would be manipulating themselves, they would be putting themselves in this manipulation, but in the end, in where there's a reality that will actually become, and you look at this ayah right there, وهو خادعهم, there's a reality that once you live that self-delusion, once you manipulate yourself, you will put yourself within the perimeter, within a circle, in where certainly you're going to find yourself living in all these different, kind of like an optical illusion, in where you're really, the closer you get to the optical illusion, sometimes you're going to find yourself really thinking that this is real. And when in reality, it's nothing but an optical illusion. And that's the same thing, in where these different illusions, you can actually not realize that it grows in where you create a narrative in your brain, and this narrative gives you another narrative, and you find yourself creating a whole system of complete narratives that really have no basis whatsoever. And this is when you look at وَهُوَ خَادِعُهُم, in where the narrative, the manipulation is actually going to grow and not going to become less. Why? Because the basis actually started out with the wrong, let's call it with the wrong data. And that's where they actually let and found themselves really in that corner. Let's see the question. What's the difference between sahun and kusala? Fair enough. So il-kusala, they are getting up for it, but they're not actually committed. Il-kasul, they might not have the energy to do the prayer. They're doing it, but then even when they're not standing properly. They might actually do their wudu, but they're, just not caring about it. And if they're trying to get up for the salah, it's like, oh, this is so hard on me. This is il-kasul. Il-kasul is really losing energy. Isahi, on the other hand, is to let's say forget, or not forget to mean that it completely slipped your mind, but isahi is basically to not take it in consideration. Okay, so that's isahi. Isahi is not to take in consideration because the person is probably busy with something else. Okay, probably busy with a game, or probably busy with their business. So what are they doing? They're basically just, oh, I'll do it some other time. That's a say. But el-kasul is basically a person that is really being lazy to do it. All right, let's continue. إذا قاموا إلى الصلاة قاموا كسالى. Another interpretation actually said kusala is that they're praying مراءة وهم متكاسلون متثاقلون. So they're actually, here's the other interpretation, in where kusala not only lazy, but they were doing their salah, they were more active when they were probably doing it at the masjid, because of course, hey, they've got other people that are probably witnessing their prayers, or they're basically wanting to gain the privilege of how people would, of course, portray them as religious, pious, and certainly people that they can trust and get the privilege of that. So that's a mura'i. Or mutakasil, mutathaqilun, to mean that they're really losing their energy to get up for their prayer. And why would they lose their energy? Well, basically because لا يرجون ثوابا. What does that mean? لا يرجون ثوابا, in where the reason why they're losing energy is really because they're not hopeful. They're not focused on the reward for akhirah. So they would lose the energy because they don't focus their mind that there is a reward. So, and this is extremely important to keep in mind, especially if we're speaking about raising children and parenting here. in where there's a difference between the way that you would discipline boys compared to disciplining girls. Of course, this is too much of a generalized statement right there. But in terms of boys, of course, they more function with that dopamine part of it, in where, yes, if you memorize this page, you will get, let's say, 20 minutes of a game, or you would get this sweet thing. They really look for a reward that comes right after. Versus girls, they actually work in a different way. They more want some form of acceptance, some form of encouragement, some form of, let's say, embracement, whether it's a hug or whether it's an encouragement. You were outstanding. So when she's wearing a hijab, you look great in that, etc. To encourage her, etc. So the boys actually look at things differently than girls. So when we're looking at the way that we would even deal, for example, with a husband and wife, for example, the wife, she's cooking something and she's just waiting. She did all the job to cook a great meal just to say, oh, the food was outstanding. Oh, thank you, jazakallah khairan, it was great. But the husband is actually wanting, just put me the food, and I want something, right there, and where it's a direct reward. But the woman is looking for appreciation. All right. She wants to feel somehow of that social fulfillment. He's looking for an actual pragmatic reward, in where, okay, so I gave you this. This is what I expect. I worked 8 hours that day. I would expect that I would come back home, I guess, find the house clean, good food, and I don't want you to be crabby. I want you to give me a smile. This is the reward that they would consider. And I think it's really important to see through the differences between men's psychology or boys' psychology and women's psychology. And same thing, that's something that for the men, we would say, hey, show the woman appreciation, because she will give you a lot more than what you had actually thought that she would be capable of giving you. And same thing for the woman, you want the man to give you more, give them more rewards of an actual product. This is what they consider an actual product, an actual service. They will actually give you more. All right, so I guess it's somewhat sorry about that. All right, so let's continue with the munafiqeen right there. In a hadith that is sahih, the Prophet ﷺ actually said,
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Aysha.
Wa alaikum salam. Oh, girl, how are you doing, Khadija? Go ahead, my dear.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Now I'm speaking about a boy child and a girl. What age did you think maybe Islamically can you send a boy child to somewhere to learn?
To learn what? To learn Islam?
I remember you're talking about it the last time, but Islam, yes, for Islamic education.
So Islamic education, I mean, when we're speaking about teaching Islam for children, certainly it depends on their ability, and certainly when we're speaking about their ability to understand, their ability to learn, from one age to another, it really differs. So age, for example, 5-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, I do see that, for example, the Pakistanis and Indians really starting at age 3, and I do see that it's actually bringing in tremendous outcomes. And I've actually taught 3-year-olds how to read Quran at age 3. And mashallah, it really expanded their intelligence as well. And it's really sad that in other countries they would think that we would start with the children at age 6, but by then, for a Pakistani, for example, and an Indian, they had already started at age 3. So by 6 years old, they had already mastered what a 6-year-old is already starting to begin with. So this is an idea. If a 3-year-old in Pakistan, in India, can actually be at a good level of learning how to read and learning the letters and getting acquainted with that, I don't think a boy in Africa doesn't have the capacity to do the same.
Yeah,
So,
mashallah. But maybe we are in US and you want to send them to like Malaysia or to Africa or to any country. At what age is it appropriate?
So if you're talking about in where you're sending them in order to, I guess, bring in a good upbringing,
Yeah.
a good upbringing, of course, the younger they are, the better, because we do know in child psychology that the most important traits that children would actually learn between the ages of 5 months and 7 years old, even though that's really strange. But there are other things that they would learn from ages 7 and 17, in where there are different studies in psychology in where they would tell you that the ages 7 and 17, it doesn't mean that it's the end of their education, but they're actually learning new skills. And with these skills that they're capable of actually learning only within that age. So even if I were to give the theory of such skills to a person that is 40 years old, they're not going to be capable of adapting to it, understanding it the same way that an 8, a 10, or even a 12-year-old might actually recognize and how it's downplayed, how it is adapted to, and how we actually adopt such social skills. And of course, what's more important than the information is really the adaptation. And this is key. This is extremely important. We usually think it's an issue of getting information, and that's actually not accurate, because somebody might say, well, I can give them the information right there. They can go to an American public school. I can give them the information at home, and I've done my job. But what we don't recognize is that a lot of the Muslim students, a lot of our Muslim children, what is actually more dangerous than the information is really this cultural and social skills that they're adapting to. They're actually absorbing certain cultures, certain behaviors without them realizing. You can go at home and say, hey, this is a wrong behavior, you shouldn't be doing this. But without you realizing, there's a lot more subliminal information in where it's becoming and rubbing as a behavior, as a culture, as a mindset. And this is the key thing, as a mindset without you realizing. So it's not the information that is really missing here. It's really what I'm feeding them with in terms of akhlaq, in terms of akhlaq, and in terms of course, the different behaviors that are rubbing on them. That's the most dangerous thing. So if we are to encourage, definitely, if you're able to send your child to a Muslim country, I would definitely recommend you going along. I think to actually send your son or your daughter to their grandmother to raise them, etc., without you realizing, later on, this will create, let's say, a separation, a division between your son and yourself. It is not the normal, natural state that we would have our children separated away from us, but you really have to be there for your son or your daughter, because this is the golden time to really create that relationship between you and your daughter. It's not enough to have them, adapt to the society, but you also want to be within the circle, the natural circle, in where you are the mother there, you are the one that is giving them I will say, the affection that they need, the support that they need, and the care that they need. You're overseeing a lot of things. Definitely, grandma is not going to be capable of doing what you're capable of doing as a mother that is closer to their age group than grandma, who's right now in her retirement age, in just wanting to just relax and doesn't have all the energy to run after the children, or even have the energy to teach them and explain to them all these different things. So subhanallah, I mean, it's an issue of trade-off. It's an issue of trade-off, those rare circumstances in where if you were to die as a parent, or the father were to die, I mean, that's a rare circumstance that you cannot control. But if I can control it, you would really have to ask yourself, is it really worth? Is it really worth getting, for example, the money, or getting, can I do things differently? What is more valuable? My son's akhlaq, my son's relationship with me as a mother. When and what is more important? When is the time to actually build this? The time to build it is really during that time when he's recognizing you as a mother to them. But once they're basically 25 and 26 and you're coming at them, I'm your mother. Well, sorry, but I didn't feel that. You were gone all that time. I didn't feel that you were my mother. Without you realizing, it's not just a word. You yourself as a mother, you will always feel that he belongs to you. But for a child, they don't necessarily feel that they belong to you simply because your name is mama. It's an issue of time in where it rubs off, it creates certain relationships. The materialistic lifestyle, we had seen the outcome in the materialistic lifestyle made us so focused on materialism and made us lose the valuable connections, and where what actually gets us closer to one another, the social relations, the beautiful affection, all these different things, those actually come with time, those come with spaces, those come with that connection, that it's not something that I could just say, well, I am this, therefore you need to acknowledge it. So just to keep that in mind. Let's continue. I hope I answered your question, Sister Khadija. Sorry, I muted you. It looks like you're actually in the check-in or something, but there was some noise in the background. Allah yarda annik ya Rabbi. Allahumma ameen. All right, let's continue. إن أثقل صلاة على المنافقين. Of course, العتمة والصبح. The Prophet ﷺ actually said the hardest and the biggest burden on the munafiqeen is basically the salah during darkness and Fajr prayer. Why? Well, that's because during the night, they're tired from working all day long, and certainly they become basically with no energy to get up for prayer. And for Fajr prayer, they're basically just loving the moment of sleep and the warmth of their bed than actually getting up in order to pray. And what does that really come with? Well, that comes with, well, why would they get up for other things? Well, they're committed to other things because it would basically get them the privileges in this dunya. So that's why the Prophet ﷺ had basically also talked about the munafiqeen, in where they would sit down, just watch the sun as it basically starts, the sun getting between or in between the shaitan's horns, and then they would then probably get up and pray, scurrying their prayer in salah. Of course, salat al-asr in this example right there, or probably salat al-fajr. And of course, they would make short remembrance. They'll just just make it really quick. Why? Illa qalila. They don't have time to make long surahs. Why? Because they want to make sure that they would make up their salah as soon as possible. So that's basically the munafiqeen. And of course, another interpretation actually said this is basically describing that they would bilqilla, rarely actually doing that salah, in where, why? Because they don't have the sincerity for it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically described salat al-munafiqeen, and the Prophet ﷺ had described Salat al-Munafiqeen in comparison with the Salat al-Mu'mineen. Let's see, Salat al-Mu'mineen, how do the believers actually pray? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes it as قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ. So the Munafiqeen were sahun, were kusala, but the Mu'mineen were khashi'un. What is al-khushu'? Al-khushu' contains commitment. Al-khushu' contains that embracement to the words, to the actions. They're really living the core of the prayer, in where when they would basically get up for salah, they would basically asbagh al-wudu'. They would complete their wudu, and they would basically face the qibla and kabbar Allahu Akbar. They would take the moment to really connect with each and every single word. They would connect with the word Allahu Akbar and recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond all. And then they would read the words of the Quran, and then حتى تطمئن راكعة. When they would go for ruku', they would be in complete tranquility at that moment. And then they would rise from the ruku' and they would make a complete fixed posture of ruku'. And then they would make the sujood until they would find the tranquility in sujood. They would rise from their sujood and sit while they're in complete tranquility, taking each and every single position as something that they would bond with. This is a mu'min, in where, of course, the Prophet ﷺ said that the salah would not be complete unless the person is basically completing the way they stand, with every single posture, every single position, whether it's ruku' or sujood, unless it's done complete. Now, of course, when we're speaking about the tama'nina, what is it, tama'nina? Tama'nina is right there. It's an issue of taking that embracement, that tranquility. You're finding peace within, and that's basically tama'nina. And certainly when we're speaking about المذبذبين بين ذلك لا إلى هؤلاء ولا إلى هؤلاء. Let's see where we're at with the ayah right there. Right there, we just completed this ayah, and we just completed this ayah. Now we're مذبذبين بين ذلك لا إلى هؤلاء ولا إلى هؤلاء وما يضلل الله فلن تجد له سبيلا. Let's go back to the words in where, what is المذبذب? المذبذب is basically a person that is fluctuating in their stances. They're basically not taking one position. They swing from one opinion to another. They keep bending their stances. They keep bending. They're not consistent. And that's where the ayah, when we're speaking about consistency, here we go, the ayah, more ayah. Come and explain the answer of consistency.
SubhanAllah, so they would be like confusing. Like you can't figure them out, basically.
You can't figure them out because they're elastic, because they keep changing.
They don't, SubhanAllah, yeah, just
they keep changing their views. If they're in a situation, usually the people that change their views, or the people that are not consistent, they keep changing, are usually the people that, one, they're not confident in their idea that they're adopting. Number two, they're also lacking courage. All right. They're lacking courage to stand up and actually say, well, this is what I believe. That they're the most cowardice people. And this is really important to keep in mind, because these types of people, although sometimes they would be with you and they would approve, and they would basically right there approve what you are saying, and then you would discover that they actually said something else to someone else. You were like, wait a minute, but that's not what they told me before. So you would come to them and say, well, can you explain to me your vision? And then they would bend it again. They would keep on bending because they're afraid. You know why? Because they cannot stand in front of your confidence. Because they cannot stand. They're actually cowards to stand in front of the consistency that you're embracing. So you want to be careful, and where don't be right there, afraid of these people. They're the ones that are actually afraid. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the mu'mineen. They're mudhabdhabeen. Listen, they're actually scared. They're fluctuating their stances because they're actually living in self-delusion. They themselves are not confident in the ideas that they're carrying. They recognize that they keep changing and bending their own principle based on the circumstances and the person that changes their principle based on the circumstances is the worst person that you would want to hang out with. Why? Because these people, once the circumstances change, then they will not be the same. Don't take these people as friends. The munafiqeen, they're the worst people to take as friends. Why? Because the second that you think you're depending on them, it's exactly like hanging on a wall or lying or somehow leaning on a wall. That is, at any minute, it might actually collapse. If the wall collapses, you're going to find yourself getting these discs and probably falling and probably going in between these different bricks and within the wall. So what you need to do is when you recognize that that wall is not consistent, is not strong, is not stable, don't depend on such walls. Don't depend on such people because they will make you lose your stability. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even during the battle of Tabuk, even during the battle of Tabuk, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, كَرِهَ اللَّهُ بِعَاثَهُم فَثَبَّطَهُم وَقِيلَ اقْعُدُوا مَعَ الْقَاعِدِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of their lack of consistency, because of the influence that they might actually have on the mu'mineen because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even said, but some of you were listening to them, some of them were hearing them, some of them were giving them a listening ear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling them, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ثبطهم. He didn't want them joining along in the battle of Tabuk. Why? كَرِهَ اللَّهُ بِعَاثَهُم. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't want them to join along. Why? So it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's fault? No, it's not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's fault. It's that they were actually creating all these divisions. They were not consistent. They were not being committed to their word. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically let them fall behind. Why? Because if they were to join the mu'mineen, they would have actually created division. If they were to join with you, what will happen? It will basically drag those that are around them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them, قِيلَ اقْعُدُوا مَعَ الْقَاعِدِينَ. I want you to sit. I don't want you to be with them. Why? Because لَوْ خَرَجُوا فِيكُمْ مَا زَادُوكُمْ إِلَّا خَبَالًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the mu'mineen, if they were to join you, مَا زَادُوكُمْ إِلَّا خَبَالًا. They would only increase in you. خَبَالًا. What is al-khabal? Al-khabal is basically division, is basically where, think of this. Al-khabal is like you're trying to push a cargo, but someone else is pushing it in the other direction. You're trying to push it northwards, and these people are pulling it southwards. What happens? مَا زَادُكُمْ إِلَّا خَبَالًا. They will increase a friction and get you slower. They will take away your energy. They will waste your energy. It will just basically not get you to where you want to be. So these people, don't take them along. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right there, it's telling us, mudhabdhabeen, these people, they're just swinging by, they'll just waste your energy. There are certain people, take them away from your group right there. Why? وَمَن يُضْلِلِ اللَّهُ فَلَن تَجِدَ لَهُ سَبِيلًا. These people, whenever, of course, they're bringing in such a delusion, they're bringing in all that type of slowness within the society, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us right there, فَلَن تَجِدَ لَهُ سَبِيلًا. You're not going to find them getting into the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because they didn't even want to have the vision to go there. They were just continuously just switching their direction. Whenever they would switch their direction, they would basically find themselves not getting to the destination, because they kept on switching their directions. With the second you keep on switching your direction, you're basically not going to get to the destination because you're constantly redirecting your plan, constantly changing your route. What are you going to do? Well, you're not going to get to the destination. If you're constantly changing your route, you're constantly not being consistent, you're going to find yourself really getting to a different direction. لن تجد له سبيلا. They're not going to go to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're going to find themselves really going into a different destination. And of course, Ibn Jinni, it's really strange how Ibn Jinni, this is really just on a side, Ibn Jinni was actually called Ibn Jinni not because he was the son of a Jinni, believe it or not, but of course, in our Arabic society, of course, having green eyes was not common. So because he was green-eyed, he was actually called Ibn Jinni, the son of a jinn. It's really strange how people actually think when somebody looks different, and therefore they're basically, who knows where he's getting these green eyes from. Must be the son of a jinn. All right, here we go. This one's really, really, really just off, Ibn Jinni was actually a great scholar in Nahu, in Lugha Arabiya. He basically said the mudhabdhab is il-muhtaz. Il-muhtaz is the person that is, number one, il-muhtaz is to mean a person that is shaken. So shaken on the inside and shaken even in action. They're not consistent with it. And he's also al-qaliq alladhi la yathbut wa la yatamahhal. What happens? They're basically they're al-qaliq. What is al-qaliq? Al-qaliq is a person that is in constant worry. So what happens? They're not courageous to wait and pause, but they're basically in constant worry that maybe this is not getting me there, maybe this. So they'll constantly change their direction because they're constantly worried. They're not consistent because their vision is not in place. لا يثبت. They're not steadfast. They're لا يتمهل. They don't have the patience. So what do? They keep on redirecting their vision. They keep on redirecting and changing their route and changing themselves and changing their plans because they're basically not having the vision and the steadfastness in place. So those are the munafiqeen. They're basically right there, مترددون بين المؤمنين والمشركين. They're swinging between the mu'mineen and the mushrikeen and not having the sincerity in faith. And certainly, they're not exposing kufr. So what they do is they're basically, the Prophet ﷺ said, quote, مثل المنافق. A munafiq is exactly like the sheep that is basically al-a'ira bayna al-ghanamayn. And it's basically the sheep, certain sheeps, when it's time for their fertility, basically go around and start spinning around and all of that. Same thing with cows. I mean, I lived on a ranch for some time, and during the time of fertility, the animals will, if it's a cow, for example, it keep on jumping, and even if it's a female cow, it'll keep on jumping and really trying to, I guess, mate and show these mating signs. And if it's a sheep, the same thing. It will show mating signs and start really searching for that. And of course, it would sometimes go here and go there and start jumping over here and there. And of course, the Prophet ﷺ had basically given the munafiq that he's exactly like that, in where they're not consistent. What is actually controlling them? It's really the drive. The drive, that sexual drive, the mating drive is what's actually controlling them, and not necessarily that consistency in where with a certain behavior and what they need to be doing. It's the drive. And that's the same thing. For al-munafiq, they're exactly given that simile in where it's the drive that's basically controlling them, the drive to want the dunya, the drive to want appreciation from people, the drive to want the interest and gain the interest within dunya And of course, in order to get the privileges within dunya. So I want you to look at this one. It's quite interesting to actually see, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا الكافرين أولياء من دون المؤمنين. So you're telling the mu'mineen, don't take the kafirin as the ones that you would take خاصتكم وبطانتكم منهم. This is key. What does that mean? When you look at خاصتكم, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, don't take الكافرين as awliya. What is الولي? الولي, that's the key word. الولي is basically one, the person that is the decision maker. Two, the person that is the authority. So that's why تجعلوا خاصتكم to actually mean where you're taking them as the ones that are your elite. Okay, this is important because whoever you take as the elite, as your, what do they call those? The people that are considered, what do they call those when the stars and the singers and what do they call those? What is the word that they call them?
Celebrities?
Celebrity, there you go. All right, celebrities right there. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling you where you cannot take a kafir as your celebrity, as the elite, as the authority, as the person in that place of a role model. If you're a mu'min, you can't tell me, if you're a mu'mina, that you're taking, whether the Kardashians or whether it's the other people, you can't take these people as the people that you follow or as the people that you want to imitate and mimic, and as the people that you learn about their history and you learn about what happened and you learn about what happened between her, Kim Kardashian and Kanye West and all these different, that's not an issue that you as a Muslim would follow from the very beginning. Why? Because you don't consider them as your elite. You don't consider them as the people that you would take as role models. And the same thing, بِطَانَتَكُمْ مِنْهُمْ. You don't take even their inner life and even their mindset, and you don't regard their lifestyle as at all of something that is of your interest. أتريدون أن تجعلوا لله عليكم سلطانا مبينا. أتريدون أن تجعلوا لله عليكم سلطانا مبينا. In where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in where, well, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you is all the different argument, the different support, in where you would know that there's no way that you could have your argument on the inside as Muslim, but then your practice and even your outside consideration is for someone that is not Muslim or someone that is a munafiq. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the pattern, remember, if He would give you the mu'mineen, He would tell you the thawab, the reward. If He tell you about the kafirin, He would tell you the punishment, basically. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ فِي الدَّرْكِ الْأَسْفَلِ. That munafiqeen are basically في الدرك. Now the word dark basically means it's a lower position. It's kind of like a level, in where in nar basically has 7 different manazil or 7 different tabaqat. What is a tabaqa and al-manzila? Tabaqa is a level. Al-manzila is a stage. Okay, so when you're looking at 7 stages or 7 manazil, so at the end of the day, manazil could also mean, when you basically look at, hotels and where 1st star, 2 stars, 3 stars, etc. So here, when you're looking at manazil, you're speaking about what each and every single, what each and every single position in hellfire, even Jannah, actually has 7 different stages, in where, of course, they would basically have these 7 different stages, in where the highest level is, or the highest, of course, when we're speaking about the highest level, is basically Jahannam, Lava, al-hutama, sa'ir, saqar, jahim, and hawiya. Those are all different levels. Let's see, Jahannam, lava is basically, of course, Jahannam would, نسأل الله العفو والعافية يا ربي, نسأل الله العفو والعافية. Jahannam would basically be of course, the top level. Lava would more be describing when you're, think of it as a burning fire, and where you've got certain areas in where the fire, it starts out with a certain, if you look closely at any burning fire, all right, you would start out with, of course, the main source of the fire, and then I'm going to go this way. And then in Jahim, you've got the actual area where the fire is blackish, yellowish, right there. Saqar, in where it's the actual burning fire. Sa'ir is basically going farther in where the top area of that fire. Il-hutama, in where you're going farther up in that fire, in where it's blazing fire. And lava is basically when you're hearing the sound, that's where the sound starts coming out from. Lava, and certainly Jahannam. So Dark al-Asfal would basically be the lowest place for the munafiqeen. They would be at the lowest place. So the lowest place, are they getting the most punishment or the least punishment? They're getting the most punishment. All right. So let's see, Ibn Umar said that the worst ones to actually get the most pain, or at least أشد الناس عذابا, the most ones to get the highest torments of hellfire on Judgment Day, are number one, the hypocrites, and those that denied Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the Last Supper. You remember Prophet Isa alayhi salam in the Last Supper, and al-Fir'aun, and the people, the Junud Fir'aun, al-Fir'aun, the followers of the Pharaoh himself. And of course, what's the evidence on that? The evidence, إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ فِي الدَّرْكِ الْأَسْفَلِ مِنَ النَّارِ. The munafiqeen are basically at the lowest point of hellfire. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about Ashab al-Ma'idah, the Last Supper, فَإِنِّي أُعَذِبُهُ عَذَابًا لَا أُعَذِبُهُ أَحَدًا مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. I will basically torture them in a torture that no one ever in the world or of all the people were ever to be tortured with such a torture. And same thing with al-Fir'aun, أَدْخِلُوا آلَ فِرْعَوْنَ أَشَدَّ الْعَذَابِ. Let the people of Fir'aun actually get into the worst of the torments. But إِلَّا الَّذِينَ تَابُوا وَأَصْلَحُوا وَاعْتَصَمُوا بِاللَّهِ وَأَخْلَصُوا دِينَهُمْ لِلَّهِ فَأُولَئِكَ مَعَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Is there hope? There is hope. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ. The word illa is basically an exception. Except those that were embracing repentance, those that were consistent with the new behavior of piety, and those that were committed. اعتصموا is basically coming from عصمة. The word عصمة could mean when you're tying, when you would get a scarf, for example, and you would tie it around all your head, or you would tie it around your hand. That's basically when it's tied out. When you tie something. So وَاعْتَصَمُوا بِاللَّهِ, it's like you're connected with a tight tie, with a tight connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَأَخْلَصُوا دِينَهُمْ لِلَّهِ. And the ones that basically had the sincerity to the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَأُولَئِكَ مَعَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Those are the people that are with the believers. With the believers. Why did it bring up the believers right now? Well, it brought it up because remember, when he was talking about the munafiqeen, he was talking about who they were hanging out with. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, what the group you want to hang out with, which is the beginning of what we were talking about, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, the group that you want to hang out with are the people that might have had a bad history, but they were practicing tawbah. And they were trying to do that commitment and consistency in their salah. And they were holding on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and being committed. They had strong conviction. And certainly, You don't know whether they're sincere or not, but it seems that by these things, what this will lead to when a person is practicing the religion with conviction, they're consistent, you could see they're really firm on it. What that will later bring is sincerity. So even if you start out your religious practice probably doubting your sincerity, do not stop. Continue the good, pious action. Continue that consistency, and you will see ikhlas and sincerity will come. It will eventually come, even if you're living in this paranoia. Am I consistent with my ikhlas? Am I having it? That's just because you're at the beginning. Continue being consistent with the right behavior, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, that behavior, that consistency, that tawbah, that, let's say, departing the history of the wrong behavior, that will change. And when you change your behavior, you're going to find that that will rub into your beautiful soul, and you will find that that will rub into your qalb, into your heart, and that will go deep into the cores of your heart, into your fu'ad. So that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, فَأُولَٰئِكَ مَعَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Be with the mu'mineen that are practicing tawbah, that are practicing salah, that are practicing that consistency and holding on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you ajran azima, will give you the great and magnificent reward. And there's nothing like that anywhere. This is the hadith that I actually wanted you to see the other day, and I couldn't find it. Let's see. Rawa al-Bukhari. Al-Bukhari had narrated. He said, Kunna with Abdullah, that is Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and Hudhayfa came along. And then he basically stood up and then said, Assalamu alaikum. And then he said, Innifaq, hypocrisy, was actually there on people that are even better than you. So obviously he was sitting with Sahaba, but he was with these Sahaba, of course, also with Tabi'een, in where they probably didn't witness all the different changes. Al-Aswad said, Subhanallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ فِي الدَّرْكِ الْأَسْفَلِ مِنَ النَّارِ, that the munafiqeen are going to be the lowest point in hellfire. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he just smiled, and Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman just sat at the corner of the masjid, and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud basically got up, and the different men that were sitting, they basically just went each and every single one in different corners. I guess the group they basically ended. And then what did he do? He basically threw a stone. It's like, I want you to come. Of course, what did he want to say? He wanted to tell him something. So he says, I came to him, and Hudhayfa said, I was surprised, and I was really in awe how some were actually laughing, that how is it that we're going to be hypocrites? There's no way, this is history. And he said, in fact, nifaq, in hypocrisy, was actually there on people that were actually better than you. They were around the Prophet ﷺ. They had better commitment and all of that. But still, that did not guarantee that their hearts can change. And that's the same thing. But ثُمَّ تَابُوا فَتَابَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ. Let me give a story right there.
That's kind of, I was just thinking the other day, I'm sorry to interrupt you before your story. I was just thinking the other day, subhanAllah, like, when you get older, you just worry, like, when you get older, you're going to change. You know what I mean?
Well, the good news is, Noura, actually, when you get older, you stay more committed than when you're younger. And that's why, the Salihin actually used to make the dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give them iman ka iman al-ajaiz, would give them faith like the faith of the elderly and the seniors. Why? Because they had lived, my grandmother was a Christian, Catholic nun. And one day I was having the conversation, you know, she spoke Spanish and I don't speak fluent Spanish. So I would, you know, use English words and Arabic and sometimes Spanish and trying to get the message out. So I gave her her Bible, and I took my English translation and I would go over the Bible and say, look at the verse here, look at the verse there. And I would basically do and engage this in this dialogue, trying to prove to her that the Prophet ﷺ was actually prophesied and that there was a prophecy about the Prophet ﷺ in the Bible. And at the end, she said, you know, your religion is the right religion, but I cannot. That's what she told me. She said, I was a nun for 17 years and I've been Catholic for 73 years. I've been devout for Christ all my life. I cannot give that up now. And I said, but you know that it's the truth. She said, I know it's the truth, but I can't give it up right now. I tried, but subhanallah, I mean, you know, إنك لا تهدي من أحببت ولكن الله يهدي من يشاء. When we're speaking about the elderly, all right, whenever you live a certain life throughout your life, there is a higher chance that you will stay consistent. The longer you stay committed, the higher the stronger, of course, the probability that you will actually be continuing on that route. So be consistent. That doesn't mean that there's no way that you can change. I'll guess the story of Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh al-Amiri would probably bring about that side of it. Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh al-Amiri was a Sahabi. Now, Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh, he basically had migrated to Medina. But then an ayah was revealed in where فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ, when, of course, in Surah al-Mu'minun, when it was talking about the different stages of human development. And then he said, فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ. The ayah that was revealed was فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ. So he was actually he was a poet. So that brought in that that moment in where it led him to feeling, hey, maybe I can make such words after all. So he went into the self-manipulation and left Islam. Not only did he leave Islam, but he actually left Islam, went back to Mecca after migrating to Medina, went back to Mecca and started warmongering against the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet ﷺ conquered Mecca, he had ordered that Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh would be amongst those, because of his warmongering against the Prophet ﷺ, would be amongst those that would be killed. But then Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh al-Amiri went to his brother, his milk brother, Uthman bin Affan, and asked him to somehow, you know, come to the Prophet ﷺ, somehow, you know, bring about this conceit, I guess, somehow intervene, somehow get, you know, just give him some time. One day, Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh al-Amiri, along with Hakim ibn Khuzam, along with Abu Sufyan, they were standing together, watching who. Now this is the first time that they would encounter the defeat of Mecca at the hands of Muhammad ﷺ. And here, Bilal ibn Rabah, who was a slave, right there, right now, mounting the Kaaba and actually giving the adhan with what word? Allahu Akbar. Right there, Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh al-Amiri, Hakim ibn Khuzam, one of them actually says, well, thank the idols that my father didn't live long enough to see the disgrace that we're seeing before our eyes. Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh said, well, I don't want to say anything because I'm afraid that the stones might actually come and the stones might actually tell Muhammad what we're saying. the Prophet ﷺ comes over and tells them, you just said this, didn't you? And that's when, on the spot, Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh, Hakim ibn Khuzam, and even Abu Sufyan, they became Muslim on the spot. It was just right there. We were just standing together, and he said exactly the same exact quote that we were just saying. And it really is a miracle right before them. They became Muslim. Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh al-Amiri, even though, remember, he became Muslim, left Islam, and now he became Muslim again, he was always shy to look at the face of the Prophet ﷺ. So he tells his brother Uthman bin Affan that he's shy to look at his face for the past, the wrong past of leaving Islam and how he felt about it. And the Prophet ﷺ smiled and said, Al-Islamu yajibu ma qablah. Islam wipes away all the history. In other words, as long as you had repented, that's where that ayah right there, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ تَابُوا وَأَصْلَحُوا وَاعْتَصَمُوا بِاللَّهِ وَأَخْلَصُوا دِينَهُمْ لِلَّهِ. This, Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh al-Amiri, was actually a main figure, a main Sahabi that brought Islam and was the leader to actually be the leader in Mecca after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. Of course, later on it was Suhail ibn Amr, but then later on was actually the main figure to lead along with Uqma ibn Nafi' to bring Islam to one, Sudan, and later on Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria right there. This Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh al-Amiri, a very important figure that we really need to learn about. Just to give this example, when we're reading this ayah, to put it within the context of how hearts can actually change, and to never guarantee that even when a person were to later bring about a complete change, let's say in contrast to the past, that they can still be the leaders to bring about the major change within the society. This, inshallah, brings an end to our right there, because I don't want to go further. I want to stay إِلَّا الَّذِينَ تَابُوا, all right? وَأَصْلَحُوا وَاعْتَصَمُوا بِاللَّهِ, even though we stopped here a couple times, but I wanted to give you, the general ayat. So before we were putting these ayat together from a different lens, and then right now we're going into, I guess, certain details and certain words in order to connect with these words and see what the mufassirin would say in regards to that tafsir. So we went over the same page, but from different angles. So I hope we completed this page, inshallah, and from the different angles. All right. And inshallah, we will continue. Should we just this little part? No? Okay. Well, we'll continue, inshallah. Tomorrow is Saturday. So yeah, tomorrow, inshallah, another tafsir, inshallah, will continue tomorrow. And jazakumullah khairan, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all for listening. So if there are any questions, inshallah, I'd be happy to answer.
Tomorrow's Friday.
So today is Saturday? No, today is Friday. Well, we're Friday in, my husband
just kidding.
got back from Salat al-Jumu'ah. Okay. Because my husband got back from Salat al-Jumu'ah. I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here? All right. So this is it. Inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow, because tomorrow is Friday for you, Saturday for me.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. So, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Everyone, let me see how I can do this. How do you do this?
What are you trying to do?
I'm trying to stop the
recording.
No, stop that. What, the sharing and the recording on Facebook. Record. I don't know how to do it. Oh, what happened? Oh well, I'll just end the class. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
جزاك الله خير.